I'm going to highlight, where'd he go? So again, if you have a question, I think we're on one screen, but it's the best to either raise your hand um, or message to me and Rabbi.
Right. Well, welcome everybody. It never fails that as soon as I start to talk, the dog starts to bark. So I apologize. We're trying a different location in the house. Hopefully the sound is better down here, other than the dog barking. But it was a little too snowy to drive into the office today to take advantage of the good internet there. So hopefully I'm coming across okay. I hope you found The Jazz Singer. I know some people may have watched some of the other versions, either by accident or on purpose. There are actually 3 different versions of The Jazz Singer. So some of you may have seen Neil Diamond as the jazz singer. Maybe somebody saw Danny Thomas playing the part, in the 1950s. So, but the one we were aiming for was 1927, The Jazz Singer, in part, really in large part because of its historical importance, not just to the Jewish community, but to the world of cinema. I mean, this is officially speaking the first full-length talking movie, which also makes it the first musical. Right? We think of musicals as being such a mainstay of movies. I mean, the great movie musicals, so forth. But there were no movie musicals before there was sound, right? For obvious reasons, right? So, this has the honor of being really the first talkie and the first musical, and it's always been really striking to me that when Warner Brothers sets out to make the first full-length talking film, that the subject matter that they chose is the story of a cantor's son. The concern about whether this movie would work, would it play in Peoria? Now there were and are Jews in Peoria, but that didn't seem to be a huge concern. For a couple of reasons. I mean, I think it wasn't, the places where the movie palaces were located were in cities, and Jews in America have historically lived more in cities than in the countryside. So the movie-going public was largely a city public, and for this movie in particular, the movie theaters had to install new equipment in order to play it. So the chances of that happening, out in the hinterlands were it didn't come that fast, right? This was a particular type of sound. It was called Vitaphone. Within a couple of years, it had been supplanted by a different system, which actually included the sound. So the Vitaphone system was really 2 separate systems that ran synchronously. So it was a bit like you would, start the film and then play the record, right? So you had to have these 2 separate systems. And within a couple of years, optical sound had become the standard and the norm. And so the Vitaphone system actually dies out within a couple of years. By 1931, I don't think there's any more Vitaphone. But so essentially what this meant is that you started the record at the same time that you started showing the film, so that the music and the sound would line up with the speakers. So it's, with the actors speaking the lines. To be fair, I mean, this is really a silent movie with some sound, more than it is really a full, you saw, I mean, it's still got all the dialogue cards and things like that. So only occasionally do the actors and actresses speak. And some of that speaking was actually ad-libbed by Al Jolson on the set, including, I think, the whole song, where he says that probably the most famous line in the movie, right? You ain't seen nothing yet, right? And then he moves into a different song, right? From singing what's the name of the song that he sings? He sings "Dirty Hands, Dirty Face," right? A song about a father to his son, and then he says, "You ain't seen nothing yet," and he starts singing "Tut Tut Tootsie," which was a big hit for Jolson. So
When I told Arthur, I said, I'm watching this. I go, it's kind of a silent movie. He goes, what do you mean kind of? And then he goes, wait, were they singing? And I said, well, yeah. And he goes, oh, all right. But Alice has her hand up.
Yeah, my question was about that. Okay, my memory is that there was just one conversation between Jackie and his mother that was an actual conversation, and I was wondering why they did that one conversation in the whole movie.
Again, apparently, a lot of that conversation is Jolson ad libs, not necessarily a part of the script. And in fact, the director was pretty concerned about this switch from the song that he sings. I keep having to go back to find the title. What is it? Dirty Hands, Dirty Face, something like that. Yeah, Dirty Hands, Dirty Face, where he's singing about a father, and his son, and that's clearly scripted. That song speaks to the plot of the movie, the relationship between a father and son. Jolson then ad libs and does one of the songs from his act, Tut Tut Tootsie. And the director went to the producer with this footage and said, I think I should cut it. It's not germane to the plot, right? I should just keep the song that was in script. And the movie was made by Warner Brothers, and Sam Warner said, no, keep that, right? And so the same thing happened with the dialogue scene with the mother, which does sort of become the first dialogue scene in sound movies, right? But it was more or less ad-libbed on the spot, so that Jolson singing the song, I think it's Blue Skies there, right? He sings a couple of verses of Blue Skies, then they improv for a couple of minutes, and then he says, and I'm going to play it jazzy, and he does it a little differently, right? So those things were not necessarily going to be in the film to begin with, but they ended up being too precious to lose, which is a good thing, because I think they're the things in the movie that in some ways really stand out. The movie is based on a play, so it was a hit on Broadway before it was made into a movie, which is another reason that I think the producers felt comfortable making this the first sound movie. It had played over 300 performances on Broadway already. The star of it on Broadway, some of you may know, was George Jessel. And I see a couple of nodding heads of people who remember Georgie Jessel. So he starred on Broadway in this role. There's some question about what happened in the transition. Why didn't George Jessel play this in the movies? It depends on what source you read. There are quite a few different things. One is that once they told him that the part was going to require singing, he asked for extra money, and they decided not, that they would get rid of him, right? There was, of course, also the fact that Al Jolson was a bigger star than George Jessel. So even though George Jessel had starred on it in Broadway, Al Jolson had already made his name, so he was famous across the country. So like in a lot of cases, when a show moves from Broadway to Hollywood, you end up with Marlon Brando playing Sky Masterson in Guys and Dolls, for example, right? Not because he's a good singer, because he's barely credible as a singer, but because he's Marlon Brando, right? And so those kinds of things happen. So Al Jolson was known for 40 years as the world's greatest entertainer. So it seems like that was a big part of the switch from Jolson, from George Jessel to Jolson. Uh, uh, the jazz singer did not get nominated for an Oscar for Best Picture. This was actually, I think, the first year of the Oscars. The movie Wings won Best Picture, but it got the first special Oscar. Warner Brothers got the first special Oscar for their technical contributions to filmmaking. So Charlie Chaplin got one that year as well for his movie The Circus, which he wrote, directed, produced, and starred in. And the Academy actually wrote Chaplin a note saying that if he was able to compete in all of those categories, he would probably win them all. So to be fair to other people, they gave him a special Oscar for writing, directing, starring in, and producing The Circus. So so this movie, as I said, made by Warner Brothers. The producer who saw it through was Darryl Zanuck. Zanuck was one of the rare movie producers of that generation who was not Jewish. He was actually born in Wahoo, Nebraska, but he still oversaw the making of this film. But the Warner Brothers, of course, were Jewish, and they were actively Jewish. So kind of a sad story. I mean, it's Harry Warner, who really is convinced that this ought to be their movie and the first sound movie. So, but one of the other brothers, Sam, dies the day before the movie premieres. And so the Warner Brothers themselves were actually sitting Shiva while when this movie premiered. So it opened on it. They might not have gone anyway because it opened on Kol Nidre, which was deliberate. I think October 6th, 1927. It was what was considered to be a blockbuster hit back in those days. It made $3 million, which, if you think about tickets, were probably 15 cents. That's a lot of tickets, right, to get to $3 million. So it was considered to be a big hit. It was released in a silent version for theaters that didn't have the Vitaphone system. So cutting out the musical numbers and just having the dialogue cards, right? So just the story itself. So if you did see it in a small town somewhere, there's a chance that you didn't actually see the innovative musical version, right? So it's directed by a guy named Alan Crossland, also not Jewish. This is likely to be, even though he made something like 65 movies in his career, I doubt that you've seen any of the other ones. I mean, of course, a lot of silent films before this one, some talkies after this, but this was his only A-list movie in the talkies, I think. In the silent films, he was actually well known for the sort of the big epic silent movies that he brought them in on time and under budget, which is something that the Warner Brothers were definitely very concerned about, and a bit concerned about Al Jolson in that regard, that he might push for more takes and more music and other things that would make the film longer and more expensive, and so they didn't want that to happen. So Al Jolson, of course, was Jewish. His real name was Asa Jolson. In 1891, his father Moses came to America and finds work as a cantor. He actually lived in Washington, D.C., in the Southwest District of Washington, D.C., which is the smallest of the four quadrants of Washington, D.C. are not equal. The Southwest is the smallest one. I mean, I think it's mostly a highway now. I mean, it's where the family lived, the highway, I think it's 395 that runs up through Virginia into the city, um, probably demolished wherever it was that Jolson was brought up. I mean, his father comes first, and then 3 years later brings his wife Nahama and their 4 children to America. Jolson's mother, Naomi, actually dies in childbirth a year later. Jolson spent a little bit of time in his youth at St. Mary's Industrial Home for Boys in Baltimore, Maryland, which is actually where, not that many years after, Babe Ruth spent some time growing up there at the Home for Boys. Al and his brother Harry are both there in that home because after his mother dies, his father couldn't really care for them so well. So, and they're kind of introduced to show business there. And the 2 of them start singing on street corners for spare change, and develop this into a vaudeville act that for a while they do together. There's actually a story, and again, there's a lot of myth and fable about Al Jolson. There is a story that he paid his brother Harry $150 a week to not go into show business. And not exactly, depending on what account of this you read, it's either that Jolson was afraid that Harry was so good that it would ruin his own career if his brother started, singing and dancing too. Or that, Jolson thought that maybe show business was not the right place for his brother, and gave him a salary not to be in show business. So I think it's a pretty unusual story. Anyway, so let's talk about the premiere of this film and the amazement that people felt when they saw an actor speak on screen for the first time. I mean, we take so much of cinematic language for granted. I mean, I think we've talked about this before, but the idea of the close-up, which is attributed to the director D.W. Griffith in the silent era. According to the stories, the first time an audience saw a close-up, they screamed because they thought the actor's head had been cut off, right? So, if you think about it, right, if you've only seen a play, right, you only see the whole stage, and you see the actors as whole people walking across the stage. Filmmakers invented the language of the close-up, of the dialogue shot, 2 people talking to each other. You see one talking this way and one talking that way, both in close-up, but we imagine the space that they're in talking to each other. Directors can actually mess with that by turning the camera differently so that it looks as if the 2 sides of the dialogue are talking in the same direction. That would be confusing, right? It cuts back and forth between faces looking at each other. Directors learned early on that they could, by juxtaposing images, make some interesting things. There's a scene in it's a Russian film. I think it might be an early Sergei Eisenstein movie, where, or it might be one of the other early Russian directors, maybe Diaghilev, where he does this thing where he has Lenin walking into the Kremlin, he's waving to the crowd. He has Woodrow Wilson walking into the White House, waving to the crowd. By putting those 2 things together, it looks like Lenin and Wilson are waving at each other. Okay? So you can create things, we talk about deep fakes now, on the internet, but even back in the 19-teens, filmmakers were already experimenting with these montage of scenes. So we take all of that for granted now when we watch a movie. But the first time people heard an actor speak on screen after perhaps 20 years of going to movies where nobody spoke, where the music was provided by a live musician in the theater, right? There, think about that for a minute in this movie. as well, right? That there's a musical soundtrack that's playing all through the movie, right? Every minute of the movie just about has sound. It's just not synchronized sound to the speaker, right? But that's how in old time movie houses there was a piano or an organ, sometimes an orchestra, a small band, right, that would accompany the Charlie Chaplin short subject or whatever. Sometimes with music that was sent out by the studio, sometimes with whatever the organ player happened to feel like at the moment, and play. So so this was a very different experience. But Scott Eyman, a film historian, writes about this premiere. He says, by the film's end, the Warner Brothers had shown an audience something they had never known, moved them in a way they hadn't expected. The tumultuous ovation at Curtain proved that Jolson was not merely the right man for the part of Jakey Rabinowitz, alias Jack Robin. He was the right man for the entire transition from silent fantasy to talking realism. The audience transformed into what one critic called at the time a milling, battling mob. They stood, stamped, and cheered, Jolson, 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 when they saw this movie. There are accounts of the movie being shown and the audience bursting into applause after every song that Jolson sang. Okay, which is one of those blurred lines. I mean, I guess we occasionally, I've been in movie theaters occasionally in recent years where the audience will clap after the movie is over. Pretty rare, because we understand that they can't hear us, but there is a moment, where that's the expectation is to cheer at the movies, right, for characters. So it's a very interesting film, historically speaking. Technically speaking, it's it maybe seems. I asked you to think about the camera angles and cameras and things, and you may have noticed that the camera is incredibly static in this movie. The only time the camera moves is in the silent sequences, right? So, for instance, there's a couple of scenes early on the Lower East Side of New York, and those were filmed on location, actually, on the Lower East Side. And in those scenes, you can see these long, they're called tracking shots, right, where the camera moves along with the actors. It's one time I think it's Yudelson the Kibitzer, right? You follow him through the streets of the Lower East Side, right? And the camera moves along sort of parallel to the action. That was impossible in the early years of sound film, right? Because you had to record the sound and the actors speaking, all those things as you filmed it. The camera was very loud. So they actually had to build a box to soundproof the camera. And so the camera was restricted from all the kind of movement that we're actually, again, very used to in movies today. But in 1927, to record that scene of Jolson singing and talking to his mother, the camera has to be in a soundproof box. It can't be touched or moved during those scenes. So the camera has to sit very still. But in the silent sections, the camera can actually move. So you see the tracking shots and things like that. But it's still partly perhaps because it's a film of a play, in a sense, which was, one scene, one stage. But also because of this technical problem with the camera, that the camera work that over the first 2 decades of making silent movies, like a movie like The Circus by Chaplin, or any of the Buster Keaton movies, you see the way the camera moves, with the characters and does all sorts of things to give you a sense of the drama of the character. And we talked about this in some of, I think, when we were talking about Sidney Lumet in the last set of films, of using the camera to evoke a particular mood, right? The early silent movies don't have that option. They just have to stand still and be as quiet as possible so that you can actually record the dialogue. So
I always think about Singing in the Rain, which is filmed in 1952, but it's about going into talkies.
right.
And that some stars didn't have a voice, and they put the microphone here and she would go like this and you could only hear every other word. But I'm sure that they were making fun of it, but I'm sure that happened.
Yeah, well, there's no question that there were actors whose careers fizzled out when sound came in because they didn't sound like they looked, right? Some people joke that they have a face for radio, right? That they've got the right voice, but not the right look, to be movie stars or TV stars. But the other thing was also true in old Hollywood, right? That people didn't have a voice for talking films. So we watched The Great Dictator, which was made all the way in 1940. It's really Charlie Chaplin's first sound movie. So he held on to that silent movie thing longer than most because he was concerned that his voice wouldn't play. Now I think he does fine in The Great Dictator, but some of the other great silent comedian, Buster Keaton made very few forays into sound. Now, his comedy is remarkable and visual, he's known for not changing his expression on his face, right? And the great stone face, Buster Keaton. So that doesn't play in talking movies. You can't hold your face completely still and talk, right? So you only see really Buster Keaton, I think, in some minor roles, some of which are delicious. He's very good in Sunset Boulevard, for example. He's got a small part in that. He's got a part in I want to say A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, I think maybe his last movie. He's got a part in that, right? And he's running the marathon, I think, in that movie, if memory serves. But all his talking roles play on the fact that he was a silent movie actor. Makes me think for a moment of Marcel Marceau, who's the only character who speaks in Mel Brooks's movie Silent Movie, which is sort of a cute joke, right?
Yeah, he was in The Funny Thing Happened to Me on the Way to the Forum.
Yeah, I thought so. Okay. Sometimes you get me off on a tangent and I'm really just going on movie knowledge, not anything I've done any research on. So I think the other thing to think about in this movie is how the plot of the movie and what's going on in the movies parallel each other, right? And this movie is about the conflict between the old and the new, right? The old world and the new world, the world of the father, the cantor, and the world of the son, the jazz singer, right? And it puts into a Jewish milieu this idea about the changes that are happening in motion pictures, right? So it kind of makes sense. And I think that that's what the Warner Brothers were thinking so it's another answer to that question is why make this movie that seems so parochially Jewish to be the first sound movie? Well, it's the story of, in a broader sense, it's the story of immigration, right? The leaving the old world behind and entering into the new. But in the technology that the movie itself is presenting, it's leaving silent movies behind and moving into a new world of sound. So it kind of fits. The play was written by a Jewish New Yorker, a guy named Samson Raphaelson. He said that the play was actually inspired by hearing Jolson in vaudeville in 1917. So it comes around full circle that Jolson stars in it. But really, he saw Jolson singing, and a big part of Jolson's act we see at the end of this movie. We'll have to talk about this for a minute, appearing in blackface. So he saw Jolson in blackface and he said the emotion of a cantor in his voice, right? Which I think comes up in the movie in the line that that the dancer Mary says to him, "You have a tear in your voice," right? So it's this idea that, and I've heard many cantors over the years talk about sort of the connections between jazz phrasing, jazz inflection of singing, and the sound of the cantors and of Chazanut. And a cantor I knew by the name of Don Kroll pointed out to me that it ain't necessarily so, is actually the Torah Blessing. It's an interesting thing to think about. So I can see some of you singing it in your homes at the moment. Baruch Hu et Adonai Hamarach, right? You know, it's pretty close. And so he used to do that to entertain us at camp when we worked at camp together. But so Rafelson was inspired by this sound he heard in Jolson's voice to write this play, which then, of course, becomes this movie starring Jolson. Just to make sure people got it, there was a program that was distributed with the film at its early showings, which included a glossary of Yiddish terms. So some of the words that showed up, like kibitzer, shiksa, cantor, and kol nidre. So those terms had to be defined for the movie-going public. Unlike today, where I think certain Yiddish words have actually passed into the English lexicon, like shtick and things like that, they did not take that for granted, and they gave people a glossary so that they would actually understand what was going on. So I think we have to talk about Jolson appearing in blackface. It's you know, I haven't seen anybody. There's been a lot lately, you know, like, I mean, Jimmy Kimmel and, you know, all the Jimmys have had to apologize for appearing in blackface. I haven't seen anybody trying to call out this movie, which is interesting, I think. I mean, maybe it's just so far back in people's memory, and, you know, it's not being revived. And of course, Jolson's not on the scene anymore. I mean, maybe that's why, but it's pretty striking. I have to say that there were a number of Jewish vaudevillians who performed in blackface. I mean, some of you watched the Sophie Tucker documentary with me pretty recently, and she was known for that early in her career until, according to her story, she forgot her makeup one time on a trip to Chicago, and so went out on stage without the makeup on, and thereafter never had to again. In both her case and in the case of Jolson, they were actually big proponents of African Americans on the vaudeville circuit. And so in their own ways, they were trying to promote others, but they were also, you know, needing the paycheck, right? But so Al Jolson did this, Sophie Tucker. George Burns, early in his career, appeared in blackface. Eddie Cantor, early in his career. It's a strange phenomenon. These, you know, and particularly among these Jewish vaudeville performers, there are certainly non-Jewish performers doing this as well. It was a well-known thing. The minstrel show was commonplace, right, in a lot of places.
Alice has a question, has her hand up, and then Paula.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. When I watched the movie, I mean, that's what really, I had always heard that Al Jolson had performed in blackface, but I had never seen a depiction of it. So I was kind of waiting for it. You know, I knew it was coming, but it made, when he first did it, it was in this scene, I think, was he talking to his mother or was he talking to the dancer? I don't know, Mary. I can't remember.
Mary putting on his
he was talking to Mary and he was putting on the blackface. What it made me think that that was obviously such a normal thing, because nobody like said anything or reacted in any way.
Yeah.
And the point, what it meant to me was that it was this was showing how it's a good argument for systematic racism, because
Yeah.
it was just part of their lives and part of all of our lives, anybody who lived at that time, and not a good thing, but it was part of the system, obviously.
Right.
Yeah, in the chat, we have Camp Ojibwa had minstrel shows in the 50s, Bing Crosby and Holiday Inn. And Paul, I know you have your hand up.
Well, I was just going to finish when you just said
Outside.
that. My camp, we did in one of our shows in the 50s, we did a minstrel scene. It was, mostly a Jewish camp. Yeah.
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 Well, my point was this homage to the Black minstrel experience, or was it racism? Was it both? And I read one review that said it was a representation of Jewish assimilation, and that by assuming the minstrel persona, the Jewish actor was assimilating himself.
Right. He was doing what the white actors do.
Correct.
Yeah.
So what is your opinion of that, Rabbi?
Yeah, I have to say I'm sort of of two minds about it when I look at it historically, right? I mean, it's obvious to me that no one can do this today, and this is why the Jimmies had to apologize.
Correct.
Right? Because they should have known better by now. It's a lot harder to go back to the 1920s and say, oh, he should have known better than to do this. Right. I mean, it was such a commonplace that that people didn't necessarily think about it that way. I do think sociologically we have to think about it. I mean, Jews mimicking the stereotypes of others looks like a way. You can say it's us assimilating. You can also say it's us asserting a superiority over another ethnic group, right? That we by mimicking them. So it may be unconscious, but that's sort of hard for me to ignore. That there's, as Alice was saying, it is representative of systematic racism, as we understand it now. Right? Yeah, I see Betty is waving a hand there.
And Nancy.
And Betty, you have to unmute first.
I wanted to bring up another thing about assimilation, because my maiden name is Rabinowitz.
Look it in here.
And growing up in Indiana, I thought that I was the only person in the world that had that last name, because all my uncles changed their name to Robbins.
Yeah.
And there's no one alive now to ask about that, but I wonder if this movie had some influence on that, of people. My father didn't change his name, but my uncles all changed their names to Robbins because they wanted to be in business more American.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know that the movie influences that. I mean, I think the movie is depicting something that's happening, right? I mean, Asa Yolson becomes Al Jolson long before this movie comes out. I mean, he's known across the country as a Jew. Everybody knows that Jolson is Jewish. Anybody who cared knew. But he changed his name because Asa Yolson was too Jewish, right? We've talked about Kirk Douglas in recent weeks, who was Isser Danilovich becomes Kirk Douglas, right? So people changed their names for, it wasn't just for show business, it was for other reasons as well. The fact that Jakey Rabinowitz becomes Jack Robin, well, I don't know, maybe it influenced your family. That's possible, right? I never thought about changing my name to Robbins, until I saw this. But I don't, in general, I think it describes something that was actually happening rather than creating something that wasn't happening. So I'd see Nancy and then Hubie.
I was just going to say that I think performing in blackface and also was very much a part of vaudeville. that people would have recognized this as familiar. As I have read about, the origins of other films where you have blackface, or you have Negro, as they say, Negro characters. So I think this was also a thing that would be very familiar to people. Unfortunately, it was. No, it's not.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, it doesn't make it less racist, the fact that it was ubiquitous, right? So, but it was ubiquitous, and those were the blinders that people wore in those days, right? So they didn't go and say, "Oh my God, how shameful," They went and enjoyed it. Um, so, so I think that's just, we have to understand that, the movie wasn't trying to make a statement by having Jolson in blackface. In some ways, just the opposite. This was Jolson's act. This is what you do. Irving Howe, in his book World of Our Fathers, tries to put a more positive spin on it. I'm not sure I buy it entirely, but I wrote down the quote. It said, "When they took over the conventions of ethnic mimicry, the Jewish performers transformed it into something emotionally richer and far more humane. Black became a mask for Jewish expressiveness, with one woe speaking through the voice of another. Blacking their faces seems to have enabled the Jewish performers to reach a spontaneity and assertiveness in the declaration of their Jewish selves." So I'm not sure I buy it entirely, but it's an interesting spin on the idea that, right, that, and I will say that I've seen, is it fair to say that in the world of blackface performance, some is more egregious than others? And this is less egregious in a sense. I mean, I don't see some of the African tribal mimicry, bones through the nose and stuff like that was sometimes a part of this kind of imagery. This looked like Jolson in blackface, right? And that's a little different. So
Hubie?
Okay, I got actually an observation and then a question. The observation, I noticed that in the titles, they kept referring to Judaism as a race. In other words, we were a race, we weren't a religion.
yeah.
And the other comment was, technically, I noticed in the movie that the upper right screen was always dark. Was that some sort of a technical problem, or was that done intentionally?
I can't say I noticed that in the version that I was watching. So what platform did you watch it on, Hubie?
We watched it on an Apple computer, and it's Amazon. What else?
Amazon.
Amazon with
So-
Al Rosen.
Yeah. So I'll take a look again. I'm almost certain it's not intentional. But my guess is that it probably is part of the issue of the camera being in a box. The interesting question would be to see is you said every scene. If you want to, you'd go back and look and see how about those scenes outside on the Lower East Side.
No, those were fine.
Right. So it's a feature of the box. It may even be a little bit of the box being accidentally included in the frame. So there was
I'm watching on YouTube, and there was no black screen.
Yeah.
There was no black corner on
Yeah.
YouTube.
Okay, so yeah, so that's the other possibility, is that in some of these transfers of old films, they're not always one is not as good as the other sometimes. So, but I think I watched it on the same platform as you, Hubert, and I didn't notice that. So I'll have to go back and take a look and see if there's something I can catch there. The question about Jews as a race, Barbara asked in the chat about the same thing. We've gone to great pains in recent years to distinguish the Jews are not a race, and we certainly aren't a racial group when you look at a community of Jews. I mean, go to Israel and spend a couple of days there, and you see people of different skin colors, right? You certainly have the Jews of Ethiopia, you have the Middle Eastern Jews, so the sort of white European Jews that we're used to because the Ashkenazic and German Jewish communities, are are white, is just the fact of who we live among, not actually a descriptor of Judaism. But it was, again, like blackface, it was a commonplace in the 1920s to think of Jews as a race. So again, I don't think the movie is influencing that, and the movies aren't creating that idea that Jews are a race. Do they propagate that idea by using the term in a card? Absolutely. So movies do have power, and to actually change people's minds. And I've said to people over the years, we're lucky that the greatest filmmaker of our generation decided to make a movie saying that the Holocaust actually happened, rather than one where it didn't, right? That Spielberg decided to make Schindler's List. And we actually have evidence, because there have been sociological studies that they gave people exams essentially about the Holocaust before and after seeing Schindler's List, and proved that people are more likely to know about the Holocaust and know that it actually happened after watching Schindler's List. So you can watch any number of documentaries and not get the same message that you get from the fictionalized story that Spielberg made. That's the talent of Spielberg in this situation. It's kind of a remarkable thing. So a popular movie does mean something. And so using the card rate, the title cards where they keep referring to Jews as a race, he's a credit to his race and things like that. It was certainly not considered to be anti-Semitic when they did that. It just the opposite. It was elevating the Jews who came to America, to this higher status, right? So, but as it plays out over the 20th century, we have a lot of concerns about being racialized for a variety of reasons, different ones now perhaps than a generation ago. But
he did a great Kol Nidre. And, if you took a popular Jewish actor today and said, okay, buddy, the last scene is Kol Nidre, I don't see it going as well. That's all I'll say.
Yeah, Neil Diamond doesn't quite have the range for it,
I haven't heard that in a while.
But, honestly, I like this version much better than that version. It's much more interesting historically for obvious reasons. The father cantor, that's even a little more absurd, is Laurence Olivier than the Neil Diamond.
Oh, right.
So, by the way, anyone recognize the actor who played the father in this movie? Warner Oland. Yeah, I see it. People are muted, but I know he was Charlie Chan in the movies. So the other person who appears in this movie who's certainly worth mentioning is cantor Jessel Rosenblatt. And I'm pretty sure that the first Kol Nidre we hear, that's supposed to be Jolson's father, that's the voice of Jessel Rosenblatt. And then he appears in a concert. It's interesting to think about it. He was actually only 4 years older than Jolson, Jessel Rosenblatt.
Well, when they brought him back to the parents, and they say, the parents are like, have really aged, and they're 60.
Yeah.
And they look like they're
Yeah.
You know, I'm 61. I'm going to be 62. I'm like, come on. But that was for the, you know, for the movie. Mandy Patinkin could do Kol Nidre. He could. He was in a Jewish choir. And Richard Tucker got credit. Yes, I saw that Richard Tucker got credit.
So what in the was that in the
In the credits somewhere. I don't know
not
what.
in this movie?
Um,
Jessel Rosenblatt got a credit.
Yeah,
Right.
it's not the. It must be another Richard Tucker. I gotta check on IM.
Yeah. So that Richard Tucker was not around back then. That's you know, the 60s and 70s. But Jessel Rosenblatt, I mean, we owe a debt to this movie just for preserving a performance of him singing a song in Yiddish and Hebrew. You know, there are recordings of Rosenblatt, who's considered to be they called him the Jewish Caruso. He was considered to be the greatest of his cantor of his time. You know, and this, to the best of my knowledge, is the only film record of him singing. So that's very special. He was a cantor in, so Richard.
This is the Richard Tucker. He was just it's not the Richard Tucker, you know,
Right,
who was
not
more.
Richard Tucker.
This isn't, you know, he died in 1942. He was an actor.
Right. So I'm not sure what he plays in this movie. I'm guessing one of the
an agent, I think.
Yeah, one of the producers or something like that.
You've got to go on. That's what he said.
But Jessel Rosenblatt lived from 1882 to 1933, so he only lived about 6 years after this movie was finished. He was the cantor of a congregation in Harlem, Ohab Zedek, in Harlem, starting in 1912. He eventually gave up that pulpit and just toured the country, as he's doing in the movie, singing cantorial concerts in different cities around the country. So the idea of Jolson seeing him, I think is very interesting. And so the plot of the movie itself is really interesting. And this, about assimilation or not assimilating, you know, how much, you know, how much of a hold does the old Jewish tradition have on us? New ways over the old world versus America, revolt against tradition. You know, the movie argues, I think, in a sense, for a synthesis, right, in the end, you know, and that you can have both, which is it's made even more explicitly clear, I think, in the Neil Diamond version. But in this version, you know, they for all they're saying to him, oh, if you walk out on this show on opening night, you know, you'll never work in this town again. Well, no, they tack on, which, by the way, the play ends that way. The play ends with the cantor's son called back to be a cantor. Right? The movie version added the last scene, the winter garden scene, right, with the blackface performance and all of that. Remember, the play was essentially a straight play. It wasn't really a musical. So the play suggested that maybe you don't have a choice. You can be one or the other. You can be a jazz singer, or you can be a cantor. You can't be both. But the movie makes a different point, that it is possible, I think, for us to make this synthesis, you know, holding on to some Jewish tradition while also becoming a jazz singer. Right? And I think that the movie makers out in Hollywood certainly had that in mind, right? The Warner Brothers, who I mentioned, were practicing Jews, but they were also making movies, right? And you could do both, right? So the jazz singer in the end gets to have his cake and eat it too. He gets to come back to tradition and sing Kol Nidre, giving his father a heavenly send-off, in a sense, and then go back and become a headliner, you know, in New York. Right? So I'd also just mention the role of the mother, Sarah Rabinowitz, right? You know, there's a line I think you can draw from Sarah Rabinowitz to the portrayal of Jewish mothers in movies, in particular in literature, you know, over the course of the 20th century. Crying, sighing, pleading, suffering, the voice of tradition, you know, religion.
Very
pathos.
dramatic. And I know the silent movies, you had to be dramatic, but you know, there, you know,
So, but she, you know, everything that you see from this to like Sophie Portnoy, right, from Portnoy's Complaint, you know, every part of the character is actually there in Sarah Rabinowitz. You know, calculated resignation, guilt, cajoling in the name of love and obligation, right? It's largely more positive in this movie. I mean, he loves his mother, you know. Gradually, this kind of caricature of the Jewish mother takes a decidedly more negative tone over time. But I think it's all there, right there in this movie.
Elaine, did you have a comment?
No,
Oh, you're just unmuted. Okay.
Okay.
I'm just listening to all this good stuff.
Yeah. All right. So we're coming to the end. So you know, I don't know if there's more to say, but you know, early in the movie, Mary says, you have a tear in your voice. And then when he sings, when his mother hears him sing, she says, like his papa, with a cry in his voice. Right? I think it's very interesting. And she says, here he belongs. If God wanted him in his house, he would have kept him there. Right? So these are lines from the play, undoubtedly, that show up in the cards here. But there is a reunion of father and son, and of course this rendition of Kol Nidre that yeah, I believe it's Jolson singing, and I think he does it quite credibly. The scenes in the synagogue are filmed also on location in the Lower East Side of New York. The synagogue, I don't think, is an operating synagogue anymore. It was called the Orchard Street Synagogue. It's very close to where the Tenement Museum is in New York, but it's just a storefront now. But it was where this was filmed back in the 1920s. So another little debt that we owe to this movie is its preservation of what the Lower East Side of New York looked like in the mid to late 1920s. So it's nice to have that document. So thanks everybody. Next week, Funny Girl. So we, as I said, I've chosen all these movies as sort of pairs. So that's the pair to compare this one to. So so Funny Girl from 1968 with Barbara Streisand. So watch it before we talk next week.
Great. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah.
Hello.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Stacy. Hi, Stacy. How are you?